The Holy Gospel, according to Matthew, the 18th chapter. Jesus said to the disciples, "If another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take one or two others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly, I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly, I tell you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything you ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them." The Gospel of the Lord. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my spirit be pleasing to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. When I was a child, and my dad would explain to me a rule that I would have to follow, the first words out of my mouth were almost always, "But what if? What if something happened that prevented me from following the rule? Would I be in trouble then?" I would usually have a list of what if circumstances, and in all of them I was the innocent victim being acted upon by some outside force that then changed the situation and made breaking the rule the only option. None of these what-if scenarios were ever very likely to happen. Jesus in today's gospel lesson must feel like my father, having to explain all of the what-if scenarios. No, the story does not tell us that the disciples did interrupt Jesus with that question, but it is not difficult to imagine them doing so. First, Jesus tells all the disciples that as they live together in community, there are certain expectations. There are ways that believers ought to treat one another that are in line with Jesus' own teachings about love and acceptance. So then, of course, the disciples might ask, but what if someone treats us poorly? What if someone doesn't accept us? What if someone hurts our feelings? Because, of course, the disciples would never be the ones breaking those rules themselves, but other ill-intentioned people will almost certainly cause trouble. So Jesus explains exactly what the disciples should do if someone does not treat others in a way that exemplifies God's love. If another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the 2 of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. So now we can imagine the disciples again. But Jesus, what if they don't listen to us? So Jesus continues, "But if you are not listened to, take 1 or 2 others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses." But Jesus, what if they still do not listen? If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. But Jesus, what if they do not listen even to the whole church? The disciples must, in their minds, be picturing the world's most obstinate person, someone so mired in their own ways that they refuse to be anything but a bully. So Jesus continues, "If the offender refuses to listen, even to the whole church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector." Of course, we know that Jewish people in Jesus' time did not associate with Gentiles, and they certainly did not associate with tax collectors who worked for the Roman government. So Jesus, in describing the behavior of this imagined person who simply refuses to listen, has set up what looks to be a set of steps for church discipline, ending with excommunication. This is a troubling passage for a multitude of reasons. First of all, it is difficult to imagine that Jesus would really say that there is anything that anyone can do that can separate them from the church, but there it is. It looks as though a continuing pattern of harmful behavior toward other church members and a steadfast refusal to turn from that behavior can mean that you could and would be shown the door. Secondly, the second half of this gospel reading raises up in me all of the what-ifs I myself had when I was younger. Jesus says, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything you ask, it will be done for you. In the context of this passage, that seems to mean that if any 2 or 3 people in the church all agree together that another person is indeed in the wrong, that person will indeed be cast out. As I think back on all the ways that the church throughout history has abused its power, this verse appears to be one of the biggest ways that that could happen. Who has the power to cast someone out? Who gets to decide? The majority? The people with the most power in the church? The people who give the most money? People who study history will often say that the ones who write the history books are the ones who were victorious. In other words, the people who won, the people with power. They were the ones who got to decide how to tell their stories, often at the expense of those who were conquered, killed, or silenced. Our sinful human tendencies to take advantage of any authority we are given makes me anxious about this verse. What if 2 or 3 members of a church just decide that another member has been harmful to them when that person has actually done nothing wrong? What if those 2 or 3 members use their power within the congregation to demonize this actually innocent individual? What if that then potential faithful member of the church is driven away? In other words, this set of steps seems to work fine as long as the people being sinful are in the minority and the majority is still on the right track. But what if the majority of the members have gotten it wrong? What if an entire congregation or even an entire denomination were to use this passage to unfairly oppress, drive out, or silence a few people who think differently than the majority or who try to hold the majority accountable? And besides all this, what if we are the ones being cast out, and deservedly so? It seems natural that the disciples would imagine themselves as the ones being sinned against. We don't like to think that we could be the ones in the wrong. But if we realize that it is just as likely for us to be on the other side of this equation, we face what sound like impossible words from Jesus. You've had your 3 chances to listen, so now you are out. If this set of steps were actually enforced, who would be left in the church? I'm not sure that the church would have ever even gotten started. How many chances did Peter get? A few weeks ago, he proclaimed that Jesus was the Messiah, but then last week he tried to stop Jesus from fulfilling his mission. Then he denies Jesus 3 times during the crucifixion. All the disciples ran away or abandoned Jesus at some point along the journey. And James and John started a fight amongst all of them about who was going to have the most power after Jesus came into his glory. Would any of us be here right now if we had 3 chances to make sure our behavior was in line with the gospel, and that is it? Knowing the disciples and our propensity for sinful behavior, Jesus could have just as easily spoken these verses like this. If you sin against another member of the church, they will go and point out the fault when the 2 of you are alone. If you listen to them, you have been regained. But if you do not listen to them, they will take 1 or 2 others along with them, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If you refuse to listen to them, they will tell it to the church. If you refuse to listen even to the church, you will be to them as a Gentile and a tax collector. But of course, Jesus knows that if we followed these steps exactly as it says, none of us would be left. Jesus also knows that disagreements are part of life in community, and actually they are a healthy part of life in community. No community, not even a community of faith doing its best to live out the gospel, is immune to the struggle to get along with others in the group, even and especially when they care about one another deeply. And it is natural that a group of faithful people who care deeply about the gospel and the future of the congregation will have disagreements about the best way to carry out their mission. I am certain that at least once during your time as members of Faith Lutheran Church, someone has said something in a Sunday school class or a meeting that you disagree with. And sometimes we might have even responded to that disagreement in a way that does not reflect God's love for that person. But Jesus calls all of us, with all of our differing opinions and ideas, to be a part of the church on earth together. These words of Jesus are not asking communities of faith to become homogeneous groups that drive away those who think differently. These words of Jesus are not establishing a set of steps that end with excommunication from the community for anyone who breaks the rules. Jesus says, "Let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector." That sounds like excommunication because we know how those in Jesus' time were taught to treat Gentiles and tax collectors. But that is not how Jesus treated them. In fact, Matthew, the author of this gospel passage, was himself a tax collector, and Jesus called Matthew to follow him anyways. He ate dinner with Matthew and his tax collector friends, despite the Pharisees warning him to avoid those kinds of people. Earlier in this gospel, he heals a Roman girl when approached by a Roman centurion, both of them Gentiles. So Jesus says, "Let that person be to you as a Gentile or a tax collector." And then Jesus models exactly what that should look like. Let that person be to you as one you go and have dinner with. Let that person be to you as one with whom you dare to be reconciled so that both of you are healed. In John's Gospel, Jesus heals a blind man, and when the blind man subsequently believes in Jesus, the rest of the faith community kicks him out. And they practically follow Jesus' steps here exactly, with first one leader questioning him, and then several, until he is driven away. And at the end of that story, we find Jesus not in the rest of the established community of faith, but sitting and talking with the one man who was driven out. These words of Jesus are not a set of steps for excommunication, but instead a reminder of how those in community are called to treat each other, able to tell the truth in love, and then able to move forward together into a new, healed way of life. Perhaps even more able to further the gospel message than before the disagreement took place. Jesus was most often with the outsider, the outcast, and the sinner because Jesus himself was the outcast, driven out of the church and killed by a majority of people in power who disagreed with what Jesus was doing. It should be no surprise then that the risen Jesus calls us, a bunch of sinners, to be the church on earth. Despite our own continual shortcomings, the risen Jesus restores us over and over again, through his own body and blood, to our places in the community. And he calls us to demonstrate that same attitude of forgiveness, grace, and love in our life together in the communities we inhabit. Amen.